In this lecture, I'd like to talk about consumer surplus and some of the basic properties of consumer demand curves. And to think about consumer demand, I'd like to go back to 1993 when Mars Candy Company began exporting their popular Snickers candy bar to Russia. Now, they had no prior experience selling in Russia, and in fact, the Russian economy was just beginning to open up, and so they based their Russian price on their price in Great Britain. What happened next? Well, what happened next was that a local Russian distributor began selling the candy bar to retailers at much higher prices, up to 5 times the suggested price, and pocketed the difference. Not bad. Some months after this misdeed was discovered, Mars did a demand study of the consumer market in Russia and verified what the distributor already knew, that customers in Russia were willing to pay up to 6 times the amount charged in Great Britain. Now this was due to the novelty of the bars and the fact that they were the first Western-style candy bar to be sold in Russia. Unfortunately, by the time Mars got around to doing this demand analysis and discovered the mistake or the misdeed, many of their competitors had already entered the Russian marketplace, and the opportunity to capture excess profits declined dramatically, along with the demand for the Snickers bar. Now, the purpose of this lecture is to teach you how to price products and avoid mistakes like the one that Mars Candy made in Russia. Some of the main points that I'd like to talk about are, first, that aggregate demand is a term that economists will use to describe the market demand or the total number of units of a good sold at a given price by a given group of consumers. Now, as by way of background, the first law of demand states that consumers demand or purchase more as the price falls, assuming other factors are held constant. We'll refer back to this first law of demand as describing exactly this. Consumers are assumed to make consumption decisions using marginal analysis. I'll consume more as long as the marginal or incremental value of consuming one more unit exceeds the price that I have to pay. But we all know from experience, and just a little introspection, that if we're thinking about candy bars, say, the incremental or marginal value that I get from the first Snickers bar that I purchase, assuming I don't have a nut allergy or something, is going to be pretty high. The second Snickers bar that I purchase and consume may give me some additional benefit, but less than the first, and so on, and I'll reach a saturation point at which I simply don't want to consume any more Snickers bars. This is the idea of diminishing marginal utility, that each subsequent unit produces or gives me less and less incremental or marginal value. We'll define a term, consumer surplus, to be equal to the value of an item to the consumer minus the price they have to pay. You could think of the consumer surplus as being roughly an intuitive measure of how good a deal I'm getting on this particular unit. Demand curves are defined as functions that relate the price of a product to the quantity demanded by consumers. Let's consider a single pizza customer who walks into a pizzeria. They value the first slice of pizza at $5, the next at $4, the next at $3, and so on, down to a willingness to buy a fifth piece of pizza at $1. So if the pizza is priced, say, at $3 a slice, this would imply that the consumer would buy 3 pieces of pizza. They would actually generate a little bit of surplus because their total value for 3 slices of pizza would be $5 plus $4 plus $3, which is 9, 10, 11, $12, 5 plus 4 plus 3. And they're paying only $9, $3 times 3 pieces of pizza. So in this instance, a price of $3 given this demand schedule would imply that the consumer would purchase 3 slices and actually receive a surplus of 12 minus 9, or $3. Now, we can think about demand curves as capturing the aggregate demand behavior for a group of consumers. So for the pizzeria example that we just considered, we might think about a demand curve as capturing the total demand or the total number of slices that the entire customer base would purchase at various price points. And the total demand curve is simply a summing up or an aggregation of all of the individual demand curves or demand schedules, such as the one we looked at on the previous slide. Now, to construct a demand curve, we're going to sort by value. Let's consider an example of a particular product, and we've got some price points here on the table that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, anywhere from $7 down to $1. And we see a number of units sold or a quantity sold associated with each of those prices. So let's assume here that at a price of $7, we would sell 1 unit or 1 item. At a price of $6, 2 customers would be willing to buy, and we'd sell 2. At a price of $5, 3 customers would be willing to buy, and so on. Now, we can calculate 2 very important measures. Revenue, which is in the third column, and that is simply defined as the price times the quantity. 7 times 1 is 7. If we sell 2 units at $6, that generates $12 of revenue. 3 units at $5 generates $15, and so on. So the revenue in column 3 is simply price times quantity. An even more important measure, and one that is critical for this lecture and every pricing lecture, is the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue is defined as the incremental revenue that is generated as the firm steps down the demand curve. So we see here a downward sloping demand curve, which is simply a plot of the points in the first 2 columns, with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. The revenue itself, which was in column 3, doesn't show up on this graph, but the marginal revenue can be derived from this graph, or it can be derived simply by identifying the incremental revenue generated from a sale. For instance, if we observe that at a price of $7, we generate revenue of $7, and if we drop the price to $6 and sell 2 units, our revenue goes from $7 to $12. It increases by $5, and the marginal or incremental revenue associated with row 2, the $6 price, is $5, 12 minus 7. Likewise, the incremental or marginal revenue generated by selling a third unit, which is done by dropping the price from $6 down to $5, is equal to $15, the revenue in the third row, minus $12, the revenue in the second row. Likewise, all of the other numbers in the marginal revenue calculation or column are calculated by taking the revenue at one level minus the revenue at the previous level of sales. You should verify at this point that you can calculate and match all of the numbers in the marginal revenue column before you proceed to the next slide. Now, a very important question is, why do demand curves slope downward? Well, demand curves slope downward because even though there's some variation in consumer demand or behavior, most goods are described, or what economists would call, normal goods. And as the price drops, the quantity demanded increases. Now, there are a couple of issues to bear in mind. The previous slide showed a very nice, uniform, linear, downward sloping demand curve. Sometimes we have different clusters of customers with heterogeneous or different values or tastes. Oftentimes, this will still result in a downward sloping demand curve, but the demand curve may not be a smooth line. It may have discrete breakpoints or be kind of clustered or lumpy due to these different pockets of consumers. The same analysis that we use in this lecture can be applied, but sometimes when you apply it, you'll get some funny looking demand curves. Never mind, the basic intuition and economic principles still apply. Also, one important question is, how does one estimate a demand curve? Demand curves are not dropped down from the sky. They are not plucked out of an economics textbook. As a practical matter, demand curves can only be estimated by running experiments, by obtaining some prices and quantities, and looking at how consumer behavior changes when a firm increases or decreases its price. And that will be the subject of a different lecture. But the bottom line is, demand curves at a practical level must be constructed empirically from the ground up based on pricing and sales decisions and pricing and sales data at the individual firm or at the individual product level. Thanks for listening.